And welcome to our webinar featuring Jeff Pollard, Forrester VP and Principal Analyst, and Yuval Wollman, CyberProof's President. The topic of this fireside chat webinar is cybersecurity trends and best practices for CISOs. So some logistics and housekeeping for today's webinar. Please use the Q&A panel to answer questions at any time, and we'll try and leave 5, 10, 12 minutes towards the end of the webinar to go through all your questions, and please feel free to try and stump our experts. There will be 4 interactive polls, and we look forward to your participation. We're recording this webinar, and we'll send you the link later so you can share it with your friends and colleagues and neighbors. And firstly, importantly, towards the end of the webinar, we will send you links so you can read 3 fascinating reports from Jeff. And I'm not saying that because Jeff is our featured analyst. I really enjoy all of his reports. Thank you. And we also have a new service offer towards the end of the webinar, so please stick around. It has a QR code. And just to introduce you to our webinar experts and panelists, as I mentioned before, Jeff Pollard is Forrester VP and Principal Analyst. Jeff, why don't you say hello?
Sure thing. Hello, hello. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. And I'm going to hand you over to Yuval Wollman, who is CyberProof President. And I will put myself on mute and let Yuval take over.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thanks so much, Jeff, for joining. I think it's not the first time we're having you in this webinar, and we're honored to have you again. I think that probably I saw you many times in the past year, but I think that it was only almost a year ago when we met in Forrester conference in DC area, I think it was. And you were discussing quite interestedly about AI and how Gen AI can potentially change anything. We'll get to that later today. What we want to cover today is hear you about the MxDR market. What are the trends? There are so many things that are happening, and we are trying, when I speak with CISO, we're trying to all together understand where is it all going? What's the direction? So many things unclear, and I believe that your insights could be very valuable to me, to the audience, and to folks that will hear this recording later the week and the coming days. So maybe, Jeff, before we start, we'll kick that off with a short poll, if you don't mind. Not a presidential election poll, but rather a simple poll about cybersecurity. So if that's okay with you, we will kick that off. Okay, Jonathan, let's start with the first one. Let me read it out. What is the biggest challenge you face? What is the biggest challenge you face when managing multiple security tools and services in your enterprise? We have 5 options: integration and interoperability, lack of skilled personnel, high cost and complexity, maintaining continuous visibility, and vendor management. All those topics, Jeff, you wrote a lot about all of them. So I'm sure it will be interesting to see the result. We will give it a few seconds for the kind audience to respond.
Yeah, all interesting topics. Very curious to see how this one will shake out.
I would have voted, but it says the host and panelists cannot vote.
Yeah,
so.
we're not allowed to pitch in on the results or anything. We have to at the mercy of the audience to see what they say.
No bias.
That's right.
Okay, Jonathan, do we have results?
Just coming off audio or coming off mute. Yes, we do have results. The top answer is 30% maintaining continuous visibility, which is very interesting. And by the way, I think that the poll is still open, so anybody who wants to continue.
So don't add anything. So before, Jonathan, we'll get to the answers. I don't want to stop the flow. Let me open with a question, very high level question to you, Jeff. you don't mind. We're seeing a lot of technologies, new products. This is a repetitive phenomena in the cybersecurity market. But how, if you look from a 30,000 feet height, all those new capabilities and services on top of that, how do they add to the MxDR story? Where do you see it, sums up?
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the current kind of issues that a lot of organizations are dealing with now, both, MDR customers and security leaders and even vendors in the space. Because one of the things that's happening is MDR has been a very successful service. It's got very happy customers. It's an outcome-driven service, right? It focuses on detection and response, and the life cycle between those for investigations that kind of falls in between. And so customers have loved the service. And I think what is currently happening from a cybersecurity perspective is kind of trying to figure out, what's next for MDR? What are the next services that should be added to that portfolio? What are the things that are going to be beneficial to drive those kind of outcomes? And I think some of the things that we're seeing out there are some services being added that sometimes may not directly complement or augment MDR, but customers are asking for them. There's a lot of things happening right now that we see where, some vendors are adding things that seem a lot like managed SIEM. And how is that gonna? And we know that SIEM is not a detection platform. In some ways, that's why extended detection and response emerged. So what is managed SIEM going to look like? Things like vulnerability prioritization and vulnerability management. Except most security teams don't own patching. So how do we produce kind of meaningful outcomes from that surface? And of course, the one that does make a lot of sense and should continue is that the detection surface that MDR supports is also continuing to expand. And so one of the things that we kind of fundamentally believe here at Forrester is that, we don't need cloud detection and response and identity detection and response and network detection and response and all these other detection and responses, what data detection and response and application detection and response. What we need is that MDR providers and quality competent MDR providers should support a broader detection surface for their clients. And should identities be a part of that? 1,000%. Should cloud be a part of that? Of course. Should applications be a part of that? 100%, absolutely. What you shouldn't have to do, though, is buy an individualized service in each one of those areas and then be on the hook to stitch those together. That's what services are designed to do. That's what we should do. So when you wind up in this world of kind of siloed or fragmented services, I think we're making some bad choices. But should that visibility expand, like one of those top challenges we saw? Absolutely, it should.
Yes, thank you. I will use your answer to just related to one of we got the results of the poll. We're seeing that it is equally, I encourage the audience to respond to the poll. Not all of you responded, but we're seeing that many are concerned by maintaining continuous visibility. So if you're sitting in the CISO seat, you want to know what's happening, and probably the fragmentation of services and controls and many alerts coming in from different licenses and of products that you acquired. This is a problem. We'll get to that later. And also lack of skilled personnel, which I believe is a constant problem that we're seeing in the market since the dawn of cybersecurity, right? At least in the last decade. But let's talk about maybe the first answer that we saw in the poll to get visibility. How big is this problem when you speak with CISOs, with security experts, and how do you believe it can be resolved? You spoke about consolidation of services. We'll talk a little bit later about consolidation of products, of platforms, but please, what do you think about the visibility problem?
Well, it's huge. And, often what happens in this scenario for security leaders is that they are victims of infrastructure choices, application choices, developer choices, cloud choices, et cetera. Security leaders aren't directly responsible for spinning up additional infrastructure and lacking that visibility, but they are beholden to it. They're accountable for securing it. And that's a real challenge. And so I do think that there's a realistic issue here in terms of, one, having the kind of visibility that you need to have a competent, high quality detection and response program. You've got to be able to have instrumentation and telemetry. In security, we're a log-dependent culture, right? We need log data. That's kind of what we thrive on. And so it's very difficult to kind of sort through the different complexities because we now have organizations that have on-prem infrastructure, We've got cloud, which comes in multiple forms, right? Even saying the word cloud is sort of a loaded term because it encapsulates a number of different things. It could be infrastructure as a service. It could be platform as a service. It could be orchestrated capabilities on top of a compute layer like Kubernetes. So what does visibility into that world mean? And then, of course, we've got this other thing that's sometimes conflated or synonymous with cloud, which is SaaS. SaaS visibility is a challenge. And of course, each one of these has identity implications that matter for them. And as a security leader, you're trying to stitch together composite levels of visibility across each one of these just to even know what the assets are. And of course, asset management's a problem because, frankly, most organizations are maybe a little bit more mature than everything being an Excel spreadsheet somewhere. That's kind of their asset management system, but they're not that much more mature than that in a lot of cases. And because infrastructure is dynamic and it's orchestrated and it's effectively alive now, it makes it very difficult to have a solid grasp on everything inside the organization. And we haven't even talked about the end user estate of just endpoints, right? With remote and return to office and all those things. So yeah, it's a constant problem. And it's not just a problem to know about it, it's also a problem to know whether or not you've instrumented it correctly, whether or not your security controls are deployed the way that you think they should be deployed, the way that you think they're deployed, frankly, and how all of that contributes to your detection coverage. Can you actually see the things that you thought you could see across that network segment or that host, because you might have something misconfigured or deployed incorrectly, and all of a sudden you were counting on a control that you now find out actually wasn't effective in that scenario. So it's at the top of the list, and I think it's at the top of the list for a really good reason. Can't dispute that one from an audience perspective for sure.
It's the unknowns that
Yep.
we need to take care of. I met a CISO of a very large global financial institution, and I asked her, "What is your number one problem?" And she said, "Access management, identity and access management." And another CISO of a different financial institution here in the US, he told me, "I don't even know what I have in the system. I need some sort of repository. I don't know what I need to monitor." And this is even more concerned. The gaps are so huge, especially if you go to a large global corporation, and we usually focus on the large enterprise market. I know you've been researching that market for many years. This is an accumulation of many acquisitions, legacy platforms, legacy businesses, first and foremost. And now you need to put things in order, and then you need to take responsibility over managing the risk, the cybersecurity risk out of it. So it's almost impossible. Let's take a step forward, if you don't mind. When you look at, we spoke about consolidation of products, okay? And this is it's a trend that we're seeing across many industries, not only in cybersecurity, but over time, layers in this stack are getting commoditized and almost obsolete because the value that they bring is being covered by others. You mentioned the SIEM earlier, but I want to take you to the SOAR. Do you think we can announce that this is an obsolete layer and we need to move on?
I don't know if I'd say obsolete. I would say that it's an expected feature of SIEM platforms, of XDR platforms, and it's also an expected feature of MDR services. I think the era where you're buying a dedicated SOAR strictly for that function is kind of over. I think instead you should be looking for that to be something that's integrated into other technologies that you have. And in particular, when it comes to MDR, it should be one of those things that's not just part of the service. It should be that the service is designed to continue to facilitate and enhance automation use cases over time. SOAR is one of those things that I often sort of compare. We're towards the end of the year, and so that means we'll all be making New Year's resolutions. If you happen to partake in that, I generally don't, but other people do. And I kind of compare SOAR to sort of the treadmill that you bought when you were going to start working out every day, or the weight, whatever it is, that piece of fitness equipment that is now used as a storage rack. You had dust on it, but now you actually just pile stuff on it, so you kind of forget about it. That's kind of what SOAR is, right? It's the thing you bought, you were super excited about it, you added 4 use cases to it within a month of buying it. And those are the same 4 use cases that you have a year down the road. You haven't worked out, you haven't done anything with that except for when you first bought it. And that's why I think that not only should SOAR be a part of MDR, but that sort of continuous enhancement and the ability to add playbooks and use cases to the SOAR as the service evolves, that is really the hallmark of something that's a high quality component of a good managed detection and response service. Because as you learn about incidents from a customer and you learn about their environment, opportunities for automation are going to surface as a result of that. And so guiding the customer through that automation journey is something that MDR providers can and should do, because it helps them and it helps their customer. It makes you faster, it makes them faster.
Thank you, Jeff. This is very insightful, and it is tightly related to the consolidation that we mentioned earlier, because we're seeing players, whether it's the hyperscalers of Microsoft and Google and Palo Alto coming in and put is only one feature part of their stack. And I wanted to ask you if actually it's a rather advanced question, and you wrote a few reports about this trend of consolidation. Specifically, you wrote about a report a few months ago about Microsoft, I think. How do you see the equilibrium that those mega players, behemoth, as you titled them, are taking us? Do you think that the equilibrium will be end-to-end stack solution, and then the service provider, the MDR that you keep mentioning for a reason, would find it easier, or can fade out because the service is rather simple because of the end-to-end solution that is being provided by those players? So my question is, do you see an equilibrium of an end-to-end solution, unification of those platforms, or something else that will be developed over time?
I think for now, we're seeing that shift to consolidation. To your point about equilibrium, though, I often view this as kind of a pendulum that swings kind of back and forth within cybersecurity and even in technology. We kind of go through a portfolio or a platform world, and then we shift back into sort of a best of breed world. And often that happens when those large mega vendors, those behemoths, are suddenly not quite as innovative as they used to be, when they're not solving all the use cases you need them for. Right now we're in this kind of era of a lot of security leaders rightfully thinking that they have too many tools, too many products, too many services, and to a certain extent, they do. One of the cautions that I give them as a result of this, though, is that really make sure that the efficiencies that you think you're getting are going to materialize as a result of that consolidation. On a feature for feature perspective, from this product versus that product, are a lot of these very similar? Yeah, a lot of these are very similar. If you measure detection on a Tuesday versus detection on a Wednesday, they're going to be pretty darn close. And so the promise that often comes from this is more on the operational side. It's going to be easier to manage. It's going to be easier to work with. Training is going to be better. When you peel back the hood for a lot of this, what you find is that is not absolute. That is not true in most scenarios. The user interface is probably the same color, but it's not the same user experience paradigm. Things have different terms for different things because they were inherited as part of different products. There might be a shared data model, but that may not actually play it out for you. And so what we find is that often in that consolidation play, yes, you absolutely can get great discounts from a bundling perspective. You can make the overall price less expensive, but are your teams becoming more efficient? Is the expertise that you need lower? Is it making a less experienced person better? We don't find that materializing. And that's where, when you kind of have a services provider that can come in and help with that, you should take advantage of it, because that service provider is familiar with the entirety of that technology stack. So I do think there are compelling reasons for consolidation, at least right now. I don't think that it's the promised land we believe it is, right? We always say the grass is greener on the other side. Like, the real truth is the grass is greener where it's watered. That's why I'm not good at that. I don't like doing it. So I have a yard guy, and they take care of that for me. And I have a sprinkler system. That's a little bit taking that metaphor and maybe mixing metaphors in a horrible way. But that's a little bit of what MDR can be, right? It's going to make sure that those things are taken care of. So good reasons to do it. But I do find that a lot of the gains that companies are expecting are not materializing. It might get less expensive on a multi-year contract, but you've still got to run the technology. You've still got to use it. You've still got to train your team. And that still is a burden. That still takes time to develop and hone. And that's where the service provider can really step in and continue to solve that problem for you.
It can take years, and I've seen it happening over the past, over the past few years. But I want to connect some dots that you put together. You're saying that in consolidation, a phenomenon that will take time, and then we'll see the other way around, as you described it. It can add much benefit to the security programs in the enterprise, but to get the real value out of it, except maybe from some price discounts that you can get because of the bundle, you need value from the service, added value from the services. They would exhaust the ROI on that investment in consolidation that you're making. So if I am a chief information security officer in a large retail company, what should I expect? What should I demand from the MDR provider? You mentioned training. I think you also mentioned earlier, I bought those products when 5 years ago, the SOAR products, it is dusty now, right? Covered with dust, only 4 use cases. So I want my MDR partner to provide with the training and the knowledge, etc., but also stronger, valuable use cases now that everything is set for you to work. Would that be a first statement? Oh, you know what? Let me throw it to you. What should be the expectation set by the CISO to the MDR vendor?
Yeah, I think the expectation that's set is first and foremost, the table stakes one. It's kind of obvious because it's the second letter, that sort of managed detection. You want to go with a provider that's better at detecting than you are as an end user organization, which is again, it's just table stakes. That's just something that should come with it. But at the end of the day, detection is really important because everything derives from detection. Everything kind of comes after that. From there, you should expect a provider that is willing and able to help you respond in the ways that you are prepared to respond. Every organization is different. Every organization has a different maturity level, a different capacity and tolerance for automation, for example. And so you might look at providers, and some of these providers want you to be much more aggressive with response actions. They might want you to be much more aggressive about automation, and you're not comfortable with that because maybe you're a retail organization, and for 3 months of the year, you're on a change freeze. You can't do that, right? The holiday season is the biggest season of the year, so you've got to make sure that you can stop ransomware, but also you're not going to take a lot of automated actions because they're just not permitted then. Well, that's valid. So part of that is kind of conducting that discussion with those providers about, are you going to meet me where I am? I know that I should respond a certain way, but what if I can't? What if I'm not able to? Are you going to work with me on that? So that's part of it. And then I think the broader thing is it going to solve those other problems you mentioned? Is it going to help you become more proactive with things like threat hunting? That's an absolute expectation that should be included in MDR. And then finally, is it going to help you get better at all of the other stuff you do? So that's where it comes to things like security posture. That's when it comes to things like automation. Are you going to enhance those things that make my overall security program better? Because if you have all this detective information and you have all this investigative information and you've seen how I respond to things, well, you've got really valuable data to help me improve the level of my security program. So once we're done handling some of these things, let's start working on that other stuff. And that's where there should be a partnership to get you there. So that's what I think about like a successful MDR journey looks like. It starts with detection. It includes quality detection. It includes quality investigation. Response should really be something that works with you where you are. And then what about proactive activity like hunting? What about improving the posture? What about things like enhancing automation? Those are the next few things that you should be looking for. Maybe it takes 6 months to a year to get there, but that's when the other stuff that really starts to prove the value comes in.
Thank you. I agree with those priorities. This is what I'm hearing also from the market, from our customers and other prospects. But I want to stop at a specific term that you used, meet the customer where he is or where she is, and ask you whether you listed in a very specific flow those expectations. But I think you also mentioned earlier in your opening statement that problems are bigger than that. The Chief Information Security Officer is not only in charge of the security operations and detections, et cetera, and automation around it. It's a bigger plan and program that he or she has. And I'm asking you whether now, as the market goes through consolidation of products, and you mentioned consolidation of services as well, from the CISO seat, would the expectation be broader to meet the problems that he or she faces in a broader sense? You mentioned earlier vulnerability management. What about the patching of it? So what does it help me? Or the repository, know exactly what I have in the system. It's not the classic core MDR value that we're seeing in the market over the past 7 years, rather something bigger. So do you think the MDR vendors should expand their offering in that context?
It's dangerous. And it's dangerous because I think one of the challenges here is that let's take vulnerability prioritization and patch management, which frankly are interrelated, right? I think that one of the things, so I come from, my first decade plus in the industry, I started out in offensive security, then I worked in MSSPs for a while, and I often kind of joke that my job at Forrester is sort of my atonement for my days in the MSSP world, right? And the reason I say that is because most MSSPs kind of devolved into alert factories, unfortunately, right? We took in log data, we sent you a templatized alert that said, pull the machine offline, re-image it, or we ran your vulnerability scans and we said, hey, there's a vulnerability. And there wasn't a lot of value there. That's why it was a high churn service. That's why most customers weren't happy with it by the end. And that's really what set the stage for MDR to emerge. And that's why MDR has been so much better as a set of services. So do I think there are valid use cases for things like vulnerability prioritization or exposure management in MDR? 1,000% yes. I do think there are, but the challenge is, can the provider respond to those things, right? So if you're a security leader and you want more info about, let's take vulnerability prioritization, for example, that's great. But if all you're doing is telling IT about a vulnerability that everyone already knows about, that if IT could patch, they already would have, there's not a lot of value in that. That's just, again, that's an alert factory. That's sort of like being a tattletale. Instead, it's, can you find a way to sequence the vendors that you're working with that can unify some aspect of that vulnerability style service with patch management? So if you're working with a provider that has partnerships or business units that can do that, it makes a lot more sense. But if all you're buying is someone telling you that your vuln scan ran, you can get that via email. That's in the tool. If all you're buying is someone that tells you that a vulnerability was discovered that happens to be important, well, that's also in the tool. And by the way, the reason why no one likes any of those tools is because all it tells you the vulnerability is important is based on external information. It doesn't take your business context into account whatsoever. So sure, it might be a CVE 10 or whatever it is, but if that system isn't very important or there are a dozen compensating controls in front of it, well, it's not really that important because you've got some mitigations in place. So I think the key is that, is there a place for it? Yes. But I think from a CISO's perspective, what you've really got to look at is what is the governance that's going to be required from a process perspective to actually achieve the outcomes you need if you stitch services together like this. And if there's a path forward to that where you can tell me about something that needs to be patched, and you can also help facilitate the workflow of getting it patched, that's great without becoming my patch management vendor, because security probably shouldn't do that. That's someone else's role. That's what has to exist. And I worry right now that what a lot of vendors are doing, and sometimes what CISOs are entering into when they get this service, is they like the provider they work with, or they like what MDR can bring to the table. And so they say, sure, add that vulnerability stuff to it without thinking, but wait, do I really need another notification about a vulnerability? I kind of get a lot of those. What I need is a response that can resolve that vulnerability or mitigate it. That's where we can't forget about the R part of MDR.
Yeah, I think that from my perspective, Jeff, it's a very big problem and a risk that you might take as a vendor. I might take as a vendor to try and solve things that are not in the sweet spot of an MDR, industry. But I do think because the problems are getting wider, you need to come with a proactive approach to the CISO and understand their problem, and also some sort of a framework, how you can connect those dots that you mentioned earlier. On that note, I want to move to another poll. Jonathan, if you don't mind, what you sent me from the list, the number 3 from the list, how do you think AI will impact, etc.? Can you put that poll, please? I want to move to AI stuff. I know that Jeff is very excited about AI, generative AI.
Sure, 1 second. I'm just launching it.
Sure.
There we go.
Thank you. How do you think AI will impact cybersecurity over the next few years? So we have automating threat detection and response, enhancing incident prediction and prevention, reducing the need for human analysts, thus reducing TCO and increasing ROI. Could be a double-edged sword. And last, currently, it is more hype than value. I think it will take a few years before it starts to provide real value. These are the 5 options. Please, audience, I appreciate your engagement. You can respond. That would be great. And while the audience responds, Jeff, I do want to quote you. I mean, it's a shared paper that you wrote with some of your colleagues, but I take the liberty to quote you personally. So Jeff, you wrote, when was that? It was, it was just 3 months ago, but you spoke about that a lot in the past few months and before. Generative AI has a ton of hype for security use cases. However, truly transformative C-level use cases have yet to emerge. That was in June. This report delves into what CISOs can expect from Gen AI now, et cetera, et cetera. So, Jeff, any change on that over the past few months? I think there used to be, I would say, an expectation to find the holy grail. That did not happen. That might not happen. But there is a genuine attempt by the industry to see how those LLM models and other engines can be, open source or specifically from the hyperscaler, we get to that shortly, can be used to find use cases that would justify the cost. This is the ROI you guys were referring to. Happy to hear your thoughts. Please.
Yeah, I think, and specific to generative AI, in this scenario, I think one of the things that we find, especially from sort of a CISO perspective, is that, can you use it to generate PowerPoints and content? So content creation scenarios, absolutely. And can help it accelerate some of that? Sure. Is there a tremendous amount of value there? Not really, except for the fact that it helps you get some drudgery, maybe off your plate a little bit faster. Can it help summarize things that you would otherwise need to read and maybe provide some good things there? It helps you get through email faster and things like that. Sure. So there are some use cases, but is it transformative to a security program? Is it transformative for a security leader? No, not really. And that sort of trickles all the way down into the other use cases that we also see from a, specifically from a generative AI perspective, where are there some things it does that do accelerate SOC analyst workflows? Absolutely. Again, content creation, writing a report. Yeah, that's an acceleration of activity. Is it tremendously valuable? Maybe, right? Kind of. A lot of vendors had fairly templatized reports anyway that were being customized a little bit. So this can take some of that off of it. Does it make your SOC analyst that much better? No, unless it gives them more time to focus on incidents and things like that. So, I think we're still a little bit early to see the use cases where this is truly going to be transformative. If you get really good at the tools, yeah, you can use it for some data analytics and things like that. But I think one of the consistent problems that comes up with this is that you do have to be able to validate and vet whatever's returned to you from these systems. And so even if it accelerates some of the creation of content, you've still got to go back in and make sure that the conclusions that might be drawn are right, which requires you to reverse engineer some of it, or to try to reverse engineer some of it. And so then there isn't a tremendous time saving. So I think that we're early in the technology. I think it'll get better. I think better use cases will emerge, but for now it's pretty limited.
I have a lot to comment on that, but let's see thank you, Jeff, for that. Let's see Jonathan, if you can share the results. Let's see what the audience feels. So we're seeing here, it could be a double-edged sword, also used by the attackers. Actually, I want to hear your thoughts on that, but we have another answer: automation, threat detection, and response. Okay. So you know what? Let's talk about you said earlier that you have some background related to the offenders, the attackers. How do you see, the arms race, as I used to call it, between the use of those Gen AI capacities on the bad side, and do you think they can actually make it for them a revolutionary tool, not as evolutionary as you just said on the defense side? How do you see the balance between those?
So I think it's going to enhance attacker activity for sure, right? We know that phishing emails, for example, are one area where using the content creation power of an LLM is a great use case for adversaries, right? It can help translate things better. It can make phishing emails seem more authentic. It can make them seem more compelling. Does it automatically create perfect phishing emails? Of course not, but it does accelerate some of that. So it can allow adversaries to cycle campaigns faster. which is advantageous. Of course, you can also use it for content creation, which means image generation, even site generation, so website generation and things like that. Lowers the barrier to entry for that as well. So I think there's a tremendous use case from that context, from an adversary perspective. And the other thing that we know is that generative AI tools and Turing bots in particular, as Forrester calls them, so think code assistants and code generators, are making developers more productive. That's just true. And the uplift from a developer perspective is somewhere around 20 to 30%, right? And that's on the low end, but it's making developers more productive. Well, malware authors are developers. They're just working for an adversary. And so if we are able, if an adversary is able to generate more code as a result, well, that could mean that they're able to vary their malware more often. It could mean that they're able to change up how their malware operates. They could have release cycles that are much faster. And so all of those things could be impactful from an adversary perspective. And then lastly, I think the area where we're seeing a lot less conversation, because sort of video gets all of the spotlight here, but audio deepfakes in particular are an area that it's very easy to use, very, very low barrier to entry, and highly specific and capable to be used in fraud use cases, in particular by adversaries, right? By impersonating biometric authentication, voices, and things like that. And so, that's where I think that, adversaries incorporating things like LLMs for audio deepfakes, we all kind of, again, we think about video deepfakes as like, we're going to make a politician say something or a celebrity say something, or we're going to pretend to be you or me or kind of whatever. And sure, like that's frightening and it's cool to think about, but it's the audio deepfake of just sounding like a person when they call their bank or their credit union or their hospital or their doctor's office. That's what's actually really concerning. And it's very easy to do. It takes a very low sample size in terms of number of minutes of someone talking. So those are the kinds of things that adversaries can adopt should they choose. Now, here's the thing about it, right? Adversaries, like all human beings, are driven by incentives. We always go through the path of least resistance. So do I need to make a better phishing email to get inside a company? We got a couple decades of history that say they don't need to be that much better. They just need to be a little bit better. So do I need to make phishing emails in an LLM to be a success as part of my campaign? Probably not. So am I going to? Maybe if I'm just fooling around with the technology. Do I need to use a Turing bot to make malware better? Probably, maybe, but I don't necessarily need to do it. I think other areas where we've seen it be used by successfully by adversaries are things like research. So open source intelligence, gathering research about an organization or an individual. Again, fantastic use case for that, in the same way that you could use it to do your own research. An adversary could use it to do their research. So there are some clear areas where it will accelerate adversary activity, but I do think that for most adversaries going against most organizations, you're going to be highly successful without using any generative AI whatsoever, and still able to breach a lot of companies before you're forced to adopt any of those technologies.
Can I summarize your understanding of those trends as we did not see a revolution taking place yet on each side?
Not yet. Yep, not yet.
We need to keep monitoring. I know that you are in touch with hundreds of your organization, in touch with hundreds of CISOs, and you don't see a dramatic shift yet. I mean, there is a continuous growth of threats, and the landscape keeps changing, right? But you didn't see any surplus that would justify rethink everything that we just discussed. Rather, we need to keep going forward in an evolutionary manner. But I do want to ask you last, because this is a must ask question. When you look again from the CISO seat, you look internally in the organization. Attackers, the adversaries might be using Gen AI tools. Easier to develop, easier to research, easier, obviously, to build a phishing email even, you do it by the second. And your own organization is using Gen AI tools, so you create more vulnerabilities. We didn't cover that, but it goes without saying, right? So the CISO now needs to be more concerned in a way that he needs to train internally, all the training that the retailer shop employee need to go through now, or in the bank, teller. Now it is a bigger burden on the CISO, or it's just the same, but with new knowledge that needs to be generated.
No, it's definitely a bigger burden, because to your point, right, we are creating new knowledge, right? These things are synthesis tools that are synthesizing things based on prompts and queries, and then creating content as a result. And it's one of those examples. I often sort of compare this in recent history to IoT. When we talk about things like Turing bots, for example, so if your developers are now leveraging code generation tools to write more code, if they're writing 30% more code, or they're 30% more productive, there's nothing that says that code is secure at all. There's no guarantee from the vendor of those tools or anything. So for most security leaders, I sort of make a joke, kind of saying, look, if I told you, based on your current application security program today and your SDLC and all those things, that you're going to write 30% more code, are you happy or sad? And they're sort of like, look, we couldn't secure the 30% less code we were generating before. So no, I'm not tremendously excited to hear that of my X number of agile teams, they're now generating Y amount more code that I'm also responsible for securing. That means that you need a more mature SDLC, you need more mature governance around your software, secure software development. All of those things are true. And it's kind of like IoT. It's sort of like IoT introduced issues, but part of the issues it introduces because it was a bunch of new devices in your network. It was a bunch of things you didn't have asset management data on. And so if you already had a problem with too much information, well, IoT added more information. This is going to do the same thing. And so it's changing where your knowledge lives in your organization. It's changing how that knowledge is accessed. And that's one of the other big problems, right? In the olden days, which were just a year and a half ago, for me to be able to hack a computer, I had to talk to the computer in the language of the computer, a programming language, right? I actually had to know how, that was my skill set. Now, for me to gain access to information that I may not have authorization to access, I just need to know how to construct a prompt or how to keep asking to eventually give me that information. And that really lowers the barrier to entry. I don't want to say to hacking, but to exploitation. So that's a different thing. Right now, if I just talk to the computer over and over again, I can make it give me something it shouldn't give. Historically, I had to know how to hack to do that. And that's a huge change that security leaders rightfully have to worry about.
Thank you. I want to connect the dots to a question that was asked at the beginning. If you remember the first poll that we ran, it was only 30 minutes ago, but it feels like a few hours ago. Because we're having fun, at least I do. They said, the audience shared with us that the talent gap is a problem. Lack of skilled personnel. Thank you, Jonathan, for reminding us the exact answer. Now, I want to ask you if those tools that we just discussed in many other contexts of Gen AI can be used to close some of that gap, to enhance the talents, or to solve the talent shortage, or at least remediate it in a bit. How do you see that happening in MDRs, but also in security programs in enterprises? What do you see in the market?
Yeah. So what I hope happens as a result of this, so security, to some extent, I've written about this over the years, security has a little bit of a self-inflicted staffing shortage, right? We've kind of decided that everyone that we hire should be able to, write or break cryptographic algorithms, know different query languages, partly be a scripter, also be able to review security alerts, be a forensics expert, a threat intel expert, and oh, by the way, work third shift, for what amounts to not a whole lot of compensation when you sort of peel back all those skill sets and what they could achieve. Right. So one thing I hope is that by eliminating some of the drudgery, by eliminating the overhead of having to understand, vendor-specific user interfaces and configurations, by making technology easier to use, what we can do is we can break away from this paradigm we've created where instead of developing security practitioners to be experts in investigative methodologies, we've trained security practitioners and SOC analysts to be experts on a SIEM's specific query language, which means that skill doesn't transfer, right? If you know this SIEM, then you've got to go and learn a different SIEM, or you only apply for jobs that use that old SIEM that you know about. So hopefully with these generative AI tools, what we can do is we can change that paradigm where some of that is abstracted away from the practitioner, and we can instead focus on training up critical thinking, investigative methodologies, deduction and inference skills that they can have, scripting skills on their own. So we break the shackles of being a tool administrator, and instead we transform that into someone that's actually a true sort of security practitioner in that sense of the word. So that's what I hope some of these tools do. I think the advantage that MDR providers have in this is that their business model is such that they're incentivized to do those things, right? So if you're thinking about your SOC as a security leader and you don't have a service provider, you already say all the time, our company makes a thing. It sells a thing. That thing is not cybersecurity. This is something we do extra. Well, when you're an MDR provider, your business is cybersecurity. Your business is detection, investigation, response, detection engineering, threat hunting, forensics, and investigating. All of those things are so the better you can make people at those tasks, especially using software and technology, the better it is for your business, the better it is for your customers. And that's where I think these things are different, right? For a company, you're going to have to overcome all of the internal obstacles to spend time on these things. Whereas with an MDR provider, for example, they're incentivized to make these technologies work inside their service delivery because it makes it better for their business. It's a side effect for most enterprise security leaders, but it's part and parcel to what you do. So I think that's one of the big differences.
I fully agree with you. I think you spoke a lot about that potential where things should go to, given the incentives and the economics of it. I really like your economic approach. But I do want to hear your thoughts about what you actually see. But before that, we have only a few minutes left before we go to the Q&A. And, we are meeting now, it's end of September. In 2 months, in a month and a half, big events here in the US we were at, but all over the world, forget the US itself. We're seeing over the past year or 2 years, rise in geopolitical tensions all across, whether it's Middle East, Europe, Asia, Southeast Asia, etc. Do you see those global trends, geopolitical trends, affect our conversation? The threat landscape, the response, the level of danger or risk to enterprises. We've seen that being materialized almost every day, but I really want your high-level perspective given the global trends.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely right. We are citizens of the world, and we've seen this year and in prior years that we operate in highly interconnected, complex economies that are not immune to geopolitical ramifications. And so I think that as we see tensions heighten across, borders, real, perceived, or otherwise, that plays out from a cybersecurity perspective, whether it incentivizes certain threat actors to sow discord, whether it incentivizes certain threat actors to conduct economic espionage, or, out and out kind of cyber warfare, that absolutely does happen. And companies are often multinational. So they have to deal with operating in these various regions where they could be operating in a country where that government is not friendly to the country of origin of that enterprise. And they have to balance themselves against that, both from an insider risk perspective, as well as from an external adversary perspective. And frankly, a lot of those are now blending together, right? Where a lot of external actors are now finding ways to get people inside the company and pose as legitimate users. We've seen a ton of information about that in the last few months from a couple of different security vendors, one that was victim of it and another one that did some of the investigating of those. So yeah, I think that the thing that this year and prior years have certainly taught us is that we're all interconnected, and the cybersecurity concerns that we have, whether they're nation state driven or just simply opportunistic, increase as those tensions increase. And as things are heightened, that has an impact on companies, and you just have to be aware of that.
Yeah, I see that, the phenomena or the trends that you just related to also lead for, we spoke about interconnected forces, and we live in a global environment. Obviously, I also see new alliances emerge, between agencies and large technology companies sharing information. This is a transformative phase, I believe, in information in general and in information campaigns, cybersecurity, and we will see how it plays out in the next few years, because some resolutions will take place. but we are exactly 10 minutes before the dead end, and it's a high time for Jonathan. If I'm right, that we wanted to leave some slot for Q&A, Jonathan. So do
Yes.
we get any coming?
Before we go to Q&A,
Sure.
I'll just share, if I can, some next steps.
Perfect.
Actually, and I'm having some difficulty sharing. And so I will reshare. Sorry about that.
Sure.
Okay, so hopefully you can see that.
Yeah.
And
Now you're not sharing. Suddenly stopped sharing.
some calls for action, calls to action. So firstly, we have some, I wouldn't say freebies for you, but we have some gifts for you. 3 fantastic recent reports from Jeff. I enjoyed reading them all. I think I enjoyed most the Microsoft Tech Execs Guide, but they're all fantastic. So firstly, feel free to use the QR code to download those. You can also find them. I think I have a little. There we go. You can also look in cyberproof.com/resources, and you can have a look at those and read them at your leisure. And secondly, I also mentioned that we have a new service offer. So please feel free to use the QR code to get to our continuous threat exposure assessment or surface management assessment. So this will give you a continuous view of your threat exposure, avoid expensive consultants, speed up your assessment strategy, optimize your product portfolio by knowing what is valuable and what is less valuable. Also to determine the readiness of your current MSSP, your current MDR provider. This is also a good opportunity. Prioritize gaps with your in your exposure so that you can remediate them, and also to communicate the requirements for cyber investment up into your board. So this is something that we're very excited about. We'd be happy to help you out with those assessments. And this is also a good opportunity for you to put your questions into Jeff and Yuval. And so let's see what else we have going on in terms of the Q&A.
Yeah, I caught it. First of all, Jonathan, just FYI, something happened and you did not share. So if you were expecting the audience to take to screen a QR code, it couldn't have happened. So I guess we will send you. Will use the distribution. Oh, now something is going on now. Yeah, maybe you want to jump to slide 7, probably, right?
Thank you.
Or 6 and 7.
So
let's go back.
There we go. Absolutely. That's slide 7 with the QR code.
Right.
Well, thank you for keeping. So please feel free to download those. And in the meantime, please send your Q&A to or your questions to Jeff and Yuval. So here are the 3 QR codes. And again, we'll have them on the recording. And you can get them also from cyberproof.com/resources. That should be quite easy to find. And secondly, we also had the QR code for the continuous threat exposure and defense surface assessment. All of the stuff that I mentioned before, I'm not going to go over it again. You can also find that inside our website. So I'm going to stop sharing and let's go to the question.
Sure. So thank you, Jonathan. I want to say, Jeff, those reports that Jonathan sent are fascinating, are spot on, and touch all of them touch very important angles in our industry. Ongoing changes in our industry. So thank you, Jeff, for preparing, and I hope the audience will join it as well. And yes, the CTEM assessment that we provide, and that was the second slide that Jonathan shared, is something that is very much connected to things that we've discussed earlier today about the visibility that is missing and how the CISO can really understand the gaps that he or she has in the organization. Let's go to the Q&A. So we have Jason. Jason asks us about how do customers and MSSPs collaborate?
Showing now.
I'm sorry, Jonathan?
Yeah, sorry, what was the question?
No, nothing. I'm just reading out the Q&A. The first question that we got: how do customers and MSSPs collaborate to transition from automation adverse to automation confident? Jeff, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'll share this. So it may not be something that the MSSP and the customer can solve directly together, because it sort of depends on why you're automation adverse versus confident, right? So generally speaking, the ingredients you need to get to be confident in your ability to automate, one, you need strong asset management and knowledge of the environment itself. So that's a hard problem, right? If you don't have that, then arguably you got to do a whole lot before you can ever become automation confident, because you've got to know what you have, what it does, what it's responsible for, because automation can lead to problems, and no one wants to say in their sort of annual review, I successfully created 18 more mess ups last year than this year because of automation, right? You want to be more confident, more successful, not less successful. So I think first and foremost, it's about figuring out, one, do you have that? If you don't have that, you probably need some cross collaboration across IT, security, even GRC to build out that asset management so you can get there. Second, you need mature processes. So you actually need, incident response plans and playbooks and workflows that work based on the kind of incidents that you have, right? You need to be able to do that. And then finally, third, you need confidence that those two things are going to work together well, that you can actually start to do both, to do each of those others. If you are missing that second one, those playbooks, the workflows and things like that, that's where that opportunity for collaboration absolutely exists between the provider and the customer, because that's a much more easily solvable problem. So there could be some systemic issues of, hey, we just don't know what we have. We don't know how important it is. We don't know our assets. We don't know our servers. We don't know our environments. Sure, maybe your provider can add some visibility there and help you out, but maybe not everything. That can always be a challenge. That one's a little harder to solve. But if it's just those last two about, we just don't know what to do when this kind of incident comes in, or we don't know what the next step in the playbook should be, or we don't have time to maintain these, that's where you can go from automation adverse to automation confident. But sometimes the problem is a little bit more systemic than that and might need a lot more stakeholders to actually resolve.
Thank you, Jeff. I want to double down on that, and that will be probably the last piece of this wonderful webinar. Do you see, and this is a question I did not ask in the past hour, do you see your answer changes across verticals, or rather, do you see an easier path in more mature, security-wise, mature industries, financial, for the financial industry, or I don't know, healthcare, for example, than others?
I guess the way to answer that is what I generally see is that there's more appetite for automation specifically, if that's kind of where we're going, but for automation in general in industries that are much more comfortable with code. So think tech in particular, because a lot of this is driven by programming. And so if the company is a little bit more tech oriented, if they're more software oriented, for example, then I find that they're often more willing and able to automate. The less familiar a company is with code, the less sort of reverence for code that the company has, if you will, then I find often that they'll be a little bit more frightened. The kind of less modern their tech stack is or their developer stack is, they're a little bit more scared. So I don't see it across verticals as much. What I really see is that the more sort of digital or software driven a company is, the more they want to automate. And often that's because culturally at the company, they look at it as, if this is a task we have to perform X number of times, we want to automate it, right? Because that's a developer mindset. So if that's the culture, then you often find it. And in other verticals, it can be easier. Take financial, you've got to have strong asset inventories and things like that. But there can be some concerns about outages and other things that might limit it. There might be more change control procedures where automation is a little bit less familiar. So I often find that like sort of the use of code is a better signal as to how willing and able someone is to automate than some of the other factors like vertical.
Yeah, I think you use a very important word, culture. Your answer was a cultural answer, so to speak. And you wrote, I think you guys at Forrester, you wrote a report surveying the cultural questions about a security organization. But I think at this point, we have less than 30 seconds. So let me, first of all, thank you, Jeff, for spending the time with us and sharing with us your insights and perspectives on what you're seeing in the market, what you research. with your team. And we are really look forward to reading more and keep collaborating with you, Jeff, and the other Forrester folks. I think these kind of discussions are, I hope, valuable, insightful, and I had much fun.
Yeah, same. Thanks for having me. This was a blast.
Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Yuval. Thank you, Jeff, again. Just one last word to everybody who's on the call. Firstly, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. It wouldn't be interesting or valuable if you weren't here. Please give us your feedback. If there's stuff that you want to hear about in the future, anything we can help you with, if it wasn't for you, our webinars would not be valuable or interesting. So thank you again. Guys, stay safe. Jeff, looking forward to seeing you soon at another event. And thanks, Yuval.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jonathan.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.